Let me preview what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to recommend some books that I think will be helpful to you in terms of improving your writing. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think of as bad writing advice, although it's common writing advice, but I think it's bad writing advice. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are principles of good writing. And then I'm going to talk about framing and making arguments, both generally and in economics. And then if there's time, and there may not be, but if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of what I see in papers that typically get rejected and what I see in papers that are accepted. There's several of you here today. If you do have a question, please use the chat. I will try to get to them as best as I can, but I may not be able to get to all of them. So you can always email me after the workshop with questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Happy to answer them by email. But first, before I get into all that stuff, I want you to do something. What I want you to do is open a paper that you are currently writing, and it can be in any stage of development. It can be an early draft, it can be a late draft, it could be something in between. And then once you have that document open, that paper open, I want you to go to a paragraph that you would like to work on. You know, this could be a paragraph that is particularly important in the paper. It could be a paragraph whose writing you're really unsure of. It could be a paragraph that you're kind of bothered by in terms of, am I really communicating what I want to communicate? Pick a paragraph like that. And I'm thinking something around 150 words. Can be longer, but at least 150 words, I think. And then I want you to do, when you get to that paragraph, I want you to do two things. I want you to underline or highlight the complete grammatical subject of each sentence. And I'm going to show you what I mean in just a minute. And then I want you to underline or highlight the simple grammatical subject in each sentence. The complete grammatical subject is basically all the words that appear before you get to the main verb. And then the simple grammatical subject is usually a single word. It's the subject minus the adjectives and the prepositional phrases and so forth and so on. So let me show you what I mean by taking a piece of my own writing. So I'm going to complete grammatical subjects. I'm going to underline whereas a journalist or historian. All right, that's a complete grammatical subject. Economists, that's a complete grammatical subject. Economic theory, that's a complete grammatical subject. Perhaps the best known economic theory, that's a complete grammatical subject. And on and on. This is what I want you to do to your writing. And then I'm going to highlight the simple grammatical subjects. So in this case, that's going to be, I've got two here. I've got journalist. Let's see, where's my, you can't do highlighting in PowerPoint anymore. So I'm going to just color these red. All right. The simple subject and the complete subject coincide with economists. Economic theory, I'm going to go with theory. Perhaps the best known economic theory, I'm going to go with theory as the simple subject, and on and on. I want you to do this to your own writing. I'll give you a few minutes to do this. And do this in both independent clauses and dependent clauses. Oops. And I'm doing it to my own writing so you can see what I mean.
Oh, sorry, Nehemia say, what about those who don't have a paper? Maybe you can take an article that you like or something that you really did on.
Sure. Yeah, you can do this to someone else's article if you don't have a paper that you're currently working on. Thank you for that. So here in mine, I have underlined the complete subject, which again is all of the words that come before the verb. And I have put in red the simple subject, which is usually a single word. It's minus the adjectives, the prepositional phrases, all the other things that come before and after the usually single word that is the simple subject. Now, that's all I'm going to ask you to do today, but I'm going to leave you with two questions about your complete grammatical subjects and your simple subjects. And here's what I'm going to suggest to you. um, the Ask yourself, are my complete grammatical subjects short or long? Are they one word, two words, three words, maybe four words? Or are they 10 words, 12 words, 15 words? You want to go for short ones. If you want to write clearly, you want to go for short, complete grammatical subjects. That's the first thing. So if you find that you're someone whose complete grammatical subjects are often long, 10 words, 12 words, 15 words, you might want to think about revising and paying attention to that. Because as I'll say a little bit later, readers like to get past the subject and to the verb quickly. Okay? They like to get past the subject and to the verb quickly. That's the first thing. The second thing, the simple subjects that you highlighted in red or underlined, whatever you might have done to them, do those words name the person, place, or thing that the passage or paragraph is about? Do your simple grammatical subjects name the person, place, or thing that the passage is in the paragraph or that the paragraph is about? Because they should, okay? They should. So if you have a paragraph about interest rates, interest rates should appear as the grammatical subject of most or all of the sentences. If it doesn't, if you've got a paragraph and you're telling yourself this is about interest rates, but your subjects are all over the map, then you might have a problem and you might want to revise that paragraph. And I'm going to return to these two things a little bit later in the workshop. Okay. All right. Let me check the chat just in case there's a question I can answer. Okay. All right. Very good. All right, let's proceed. So why is it? There we go. Okay, so I want to recommend I want to recommend some books to you that I think you're going to find helpful. So if you're interested in writing clearly and simply, and I think we probably are, or at least we probably should be, I've got 3 books that I want to recommend to you. The first book is called Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace. Style was originally by a Chicago English professor named Joseph Williams, who died in 2008. He acquired a co-author, and the co-author is now continuing the book. Joseph Bishop is the co-author. You'll learn in this book such principles like the one that we just talked about, that you can think of your writing as a story, quote unquote story, with quote unquote characters. The characters and the subjects, the grammatical subjects, should more or less coincide. That's one of the principles that they talk about in this book. They talk about the fact that you should begin sentences with old information and end sentences with new information. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. I think Style is now in its 12th edition. You can find lots of cheap copies online. I recommend the later editions because the later editions, in addition to discussing sentence level issues, they also talk about papers as a whole. So I recommend the later editions of Style. Second book that I want to recommend, Expectations, Teaching Writing from the Reader's Perspective. And this is a book by a guy named George Gopin, who is a retired professor of rhetoric at Duke University. And Gopin and Williams and Bishop, their books basically say the same thing. In fact, Williams and Gopin were working together at one point early on in this process. I think Expectations it's a bigger book. It's slightly more technical. It's probably designed more to actually be read than to work through, but it's a great book. Gopin has fantastic discussions of paragraph structure and good discussions of how long should a sentence be. He's very good on that. The third book that I want to recommend to you is a book, a fairly new book called Writing Science in Plain English by Anne Green, who was a biology professor at the University of Montana in the United States. And Anne Green's book is modeled after Williams and Bizzop. She explicitly says so, and it is. It's the shortest of the three books, so it's probably the easiest to deal with in that regard. It's only about 120 pages long. She recapitulates a lot of the things that Williams and Bizzop says, and indeed a lot of the things that Gopin says too. So those are the three books that I would recommend. If you were only going to get one of these books, I would get Style. If you're only going to get one, I would get Style. Okay. Just checking the chat here. Next book I want to recommend, and we're going to be coming back to this book later in the workshop. It's a book called Academic Writing for Graduate Students, and it's by two University of Michigan linguistic scholars who specialize in academic genre writing, John Swales and Christine Feek. Their book was originally, when it first came out, was explicitly directed toward non-native speakers of English. In fact, I think it even had non-native English speakers in the title or something like that. They have very wisely changed the title to direct it at all graduate students. And the reason I think that's wise is because even native English speakers have the same problems that non-native speakers have in terms of argumentation, how to set up a literature review, how to talk about data, how to construct an abstract. They get into all of those things in this book. We're going to return to this book. I think I think the third edition is the most recent edition. I have not been able to find a later edition. So I think that's the most recent one. Another book I want to recommend, and this is a new book. It came out in 2021. It's called The Economist's Craft by an economist at the Ohio State University. And this is a terrific book. It's really about professional development and how to be a professional in the field. So he talks about choosing an advisor, going to conferences, submitting papers, writing papers, presenting papers. He deals with all of those things. So if you're an economist in training and would like to make a career out of this, you've got to read this book. I mean, it's really, really good. He covers all the things that you could possibly want him to cover. One more. You should know the work of Helen Sword. So Helen Sword is a former professor of comparative literature at the University of Auckland. And she has made a career out of studying and working with academics and their writing. She's no longer in academia. She's formed her own writing company and does workshops and retreats and things like that. One of her books is called Stylish Academic Writing, where you'll find, among many things, the statement that concrete nouns, so Google rather than firm, grocery shopper rather than consumer, concrete nouns is arguably the single most valuable tool in the stylish writer's toolbox. And we're going to return to that point a little bit later in the workshop. All right, let's see if I can get to the chat here. There's nothing. All right, so let's move on. All right, I want to talk about bad writing advice. With with many apologies to your thesis advisors and other folks like that, you've probably gotten some advice, and it's probably bad. And let me tell you the 4 pieces of advice that you've probably gotten that I think are bad pieces of advice. Okay. The first one is write short sentences. Okay. This is a very common piece of advice, and it's very tempting. I mean, it stands to reason if I only write short sentences, I'll minimize the chances I'm going to create a problem, right? It sounds really tempting, right? This is the answer. Well, it's just impractical advice. I mean, for one thing, if you really took this advice to heart and wrote nothing but, say, 10-word sentences, your writing is going to be tedious. It's going to be annoying. It's just not going to be good writing. Besides, the work that we do, I mean, it requires, we often have to express ideas and show relationships. I knew there'd be a question about this. We often have to express ideas and show relationships that require longer sentences, sophisticated grammatical elements, those kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying short sentences are bad. What I'm saying is, don't adopt as a categorical rule, I'm only going to write short sentences. Okay. Use a short sentence when you need to use a short sentence. Use a long sentence when you need to use a long sentence. Sometimes a short sentence juxtaposed against 3 or 4 long ones can be very effective. All of that is under what I think of as the art of writing, knowing how to use sentence length. It's an art. It's something you get better at over time with experience. Okay. Well, that's the first piece. Let me see what the chats are. We got 4 of them. I figured this would do that. Okay, no one's objecting strenuously here. Okay, that's the first piece of bad advice that you've probably gotten, that I think you should just, what you should be told is, use short sentences when they're called for, otherwise don't. That's really the advice you should get. Second piece of advice that you've probably gotten that I think is bad: don't use the same word twice. Okay. There's this idea out here that if you use the same word twice, you're going to bore your reader and they're going to lose interest and blah, 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 right? All that kind of stuff. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, you go, I used wages in one sentence, so I think I'll use remuneration in the next sentence, and then income in the third, and how about returns to work? That sounds really good. I'll use that in the 4th sentence. And then, compensation. I haven't used that yet. Let's use compensation now. And then maybe, how about monetary rewards? Let's do monetary rewards. Don't do that. That's simply bad advice. Okay. What you actually want to do, especially in technical writing, is use the same term over and over again. That's what you want to do. And I'm going to say more about that in a little bit later in the workshop. Okay. There's good repetition. There's bad repetition. I'm talking here about bad repetition. Generally speaking, you should call it wages. If that's what it is, call it wages. Don't think you need to come up with a different word every time you use the word. I'm now being told my internet. Hopefully I'm back online. Okay. Another piece of advice that you've probably gotten, which is bad advice: vary your sentence beginnings. Kind of similar to don't use the same word twice. The idea is, well, if you begin every sentence with he or the model, you're just going to bore your reader and you want to vary things up. You don't want to do that. If you're telling a continuing story, if you're in a extended discussion about a model or a technique or a piece of literature, okay, you want that model, you want that technique, you want that piece of literature to begin every sentence. That's how you create flow in writing. And you give the reader something the reader desperately needs at the beginning of each of those sentences. How does this sentence connect with what I just read? Okay. So be very careful about varying how you begin your sentences. Okay. And then the final piece of advice you've probably gotten, and George Gopin calls this the single worst piece of advice that any writer ever gets. Avoid the passive voice. Bad piece of advice. Why is this a bad piece of advice? Well, the passive voices actually can be very, very useful and often is the best choice in several cases. The passive voice, as Gopin and as Williams and Bissop discuss, allows you to shift certain terms, certain words to the beginning of a sentence. And sometimes you want to do that to create flow. Sometimes you don't want to show agency. Maybe there is no agent. Maybe it's not wise or sensible to show agency. In that case, the passive voice might actually be your best bet. Now, I'm not saying always write in the passive voice. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that there are well, there are more than two voices, but there's the active voice, there's the passive voice, and you should use whichever one is appropriate to use at that moment. That's what I'm saying. Let me see if there are any questions or comments. Sort of can't get the...
If not, I can tell you if there is some question, Paul.
There is a question, okay.
No, I can tell you if there
Oh,
is.
okay, great. Okay, thank you, Diane. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's go to what's some advice that you actually should be told instead than the things that I just went through. Okay, let's go through these. And these are all in Bissop and Williams and Gopin and Anne Green, all this stuff is in there, as well as in many other writing guides. Okay. I don't know what it's like in other languages, but in English, good writing begins with a subject, and I should say a short subject, followed immediately by a verb. That's the foundation of simple, clear writing right there. A short subject followed immediately by a verb. Okay. But not just any subject and not just any verb. Okay. One thing, readers prefer flesh and blood subjects. People like to read about people. They like to read about animals. That's what they like to read about. You pick up any highbrow sort of literary type magazine out there and start reading a feature story, 9 times out of 10, they begin with a person because that's what people want to read about. So flesh and blood subjects. We estimate, we model, we analyze. We is a flesh and blood subject. Economists, flesh and blood subject. Labradors, Cocker Spaniels, German Shepherds, Pekingese cats, tarantulas, flesh and blood subjects. Bus drivers, college professors, these are all flesh and blood subjects. Okay, that's what readers prefer. So one of the reasons why academic writing, including academic writing in economics, gives so many people trouble is because we're often writing about not flesh and blood subjects, but abstractions. That's why. That's a big reason why right there. Readers also prefer, when it comes to their subjects, They like specific, concrete subjects, okay? They don't want to read about firms. They want to read about Google. They want to read about Bank of America. They don't want to read about governments. They want to read about the Italian government or the English government. They don't want to read about banks. They want to read about the European Central Bank. They want concrete, specific subjects. New York, Manchester United, New York, not city, Manchester United, not team, George Soros, not philanthropist, Microsoft, not computer software company, the Toyota RAV4, not car. They like specific, concrete subjects. Again, this is why academic writing gives a lot of people trouble, because we don't write about those things. What do we write about? We write about the firm. We write about the consumer. Or even worse, we write about the agent, right? Which is even more abstract than consumer or firm. That's why people have trouble right there. That's why they have trouble. See how we're doing on time. So you're going to write with abstractions, but try to avoid them as much as possible if you want your writing to connect with as many readers as possible. Abstractions like argument, intervention, belief, over provision, implementation, resistance, opposition, all those things are abstractions. And we're going to return to abstractions in just a minute, because there's a special term for all of these things. We're going to come back to that. Readers prefer not only flesh and blood subjects, not only concrete specific subjects, readers prefer short subjects, one-word subjects, two-word subjects, three-word subjects. I wouldn't try to go much beyond that. iPads, the Brooklyn Bridge, the book, the train, he, short subjects followed immediately by a verb. What you want to do is watch out for the long subject. Here's a 17-word subject from the JPE. Our focus on games with agents who can acquire information about the endogenous actions of other agents. 17-word subject. Here's a 19-word subject from the Review of Economic Studies. Our empirical results on the transmission mechanism of monetary policy via its impact on risk premia spreads and volatility. Finally, we get to the verb. Something to just watch out for in your writing. If you're someone who regularly has long, complete subjects, then your writing is going to give people trouble. And you should think about how you can revise those sentences so that you have short subjects, or at least considerably shorter subjects. So watch the long subjects. So I said not just any readers like, I said clear writing begins with a subject followed immediately by a verb, not just any subject, not just any verb. And here's what I'm talking about. Readers like action verbs. In other words, they like actions expressed as verbs, not hidden in nouns. And you're thinking, Paul, what does this mean? This just sounds crazy to me. What could you possibly mean here? Well, let me show you what I mean. Let me show you. Nominalizations, that's what I'm talking about. Nouns that hide actions. So we make the assumption. The verb here is make. That's the verb. But the real action going on is somebody's assuming something. That's the real action. So why not we assume? Get rid of the nominalization. You now have a verb that expresses what's really going on. And instead of using 4 words, now you're using only 2. By the way, this should be a tip to you. If you ever need to shorten something And I don't mean going from 10,000 words to 7,000 words. That's a different, I mean, if you need to cut like 500 words out of something or 300 words out of something, the first place to look is your verb structure and to see whether or not you're using single word verbs, as in we assume, or if you're using a nominalization like assumption plus in combination with a verb. That's the first place to start looking if you're looking to cut some words. Other examples, we conducted an analysis. Well, the verb here is conducted, but what's really going on is somebody is analyzing something. So why not write we analyzed? Again, 2 words instead of 4. Here's another example. The book provides an illustration. The verb here is provides, but what's really going on is the book is illustrating something. So why not just write the book illustrates? 3 words instead of 5. The group had a discussion. The verb here is had, doesn't really tell us a whole lot. The action is hidden in the noun discussion. Why not just write the group discussed? Okay. I think my next slide's one more. Oh yeah, this is a good one. The intention of the committee is to vote. So the verb here is, which really doesn't tell us a whole lot about what's going on here. The real action is that the committee intends something. They intend to vote, but the action intend is hidden in this noun intention. So why not just write the committee intends to vote? Now you've got a 5-word sentence instead of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, instead of an 8-word sentence. And you have a 2-word complete subject, the committee, versus a 5-word complete subject, the intention of the committee. So you get to the verb a lot faster, which is what readers like. Okay, let's take a short break, 5 minutes. And then I'm going to come back and talk about framing and making arguments, both generally and in economics. So I'm going to set my timer. I've got 48 minutes after the hour. So let's come back at 53 minutes after the hour. And we'll talk about framing and making arguments. All right, see you in just a few minutes. I mean, the answer is you can if you think it's if it will make for a better abstract. But it's interesting. Economists don't really, at least in academic papers, don't really use a lot of quotations. It's kind of an interesting. It's not that they never use them, but they don't use them that often. It's kind of an interesting characteristic of economics writing. And it could be other disciplines are the same way. Now, because of time, I want to move to framing. I was going to say more about sentence level things, but I want you to do one more thing before we talk about framing. So we're back, everyone. I want you to go back to that document you opened at the beginning of the workshop. And I want you to go back to that same paragraph. And here's what I want you to do this time. I want you to underline or highlight the last 5 or 6 words of every sentence in that paragraph. And then I want you to ask yourself, do those words convey the most important information in the sentence? Because they should. So the place to put information that you want to emphasize is at the end of a sentence. We don't have time to say more about that during this workshop, but I can say more about it at the subsequent workshops. And in fact, George Gopin, the author of Expectations, Teaching Writing from the Reader's Perspective, George Gopin goes so far as to say this is the biggest problem he sees with academic writers, is they don't populate the ends of their sentences with important information. They instead either bury that information in the middle of a sentence or they stick it at the beginning of a sentence. Now, the beginning of a sentence gets emphasis too, but not as much as the end of a sentence, especially the longer your sentences are. The longer your sentences are, the more emphasis the end of the sentence has. So if you've underlined the last 5 or 6 words of every sentence and ask yourself, gee, do these words convey the most important information in the sentence? And your answer is no, then you might want to revise that sentence. Okay, in our remaining time, I want to talk about framing and making arguments, both generally and in economics. And then if we're going until 11:30, 30 minutes after the hour, 11:30 my time. And then if I have some time, I'll talk about characteristics of papers that are rejected or accepted. Okay. So let's talk about framing and making arguments. So I emailed a random sample of the folks who registered for today's workshop beforehand and asked them to tell me what they want me to address in the workshop. And most of them said this, that they wanted to talk about making arguments. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Framing and making arguments. Whoops, that's not what I want to do. This is what I want to do. Okay, let me go back. How can I go?
Well, you have a question in the chat. I want to ask, what do you mean by importance which should be placed at the end of the sentences? By Ahmed Sadiki.
Say that one more time. It was something about importance at the end of a sentence. I'm sorry.
No, he's just saying, what do you mean by importance when you place
Okay.
the word at the end of the sentences?
So
I'm trying to ask, what do you mean by importance? What is important to be placed at the end of sentences? What do you mean by important data? What is that?
That's a great question. Thank you. So you can think of a sentence as having 2 kinds of information: old information and new information. The old information is what connects the sentence to what's come before. So if you were writing a paragraph about an economic model, then economic model should appear at the beginning of most or all of your sentences, and it would function as old information, information that your reader has already encountered. New information is information that your reader has not yet encountered. So by definition, almost by definition, it should be the important piece of information in the sentence. It's why you're writing the sentence in the first place, to convey this new information. So by important, I mean, these are relative terms, but by important, I basically mean anything that's new or anything that you want to emphasize in the sentence. That's what I mean. And there are excellent discussions of this in Gopin and in Williams and Bizup.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Maybe at a later
Thank you.
workshop we can talk more about that. Okay. Framing and making arguments. I want to talk about making and motivating arguments first in general, and then in economics. The two resemble each other. So the first half of this workshop was about sentence level matters for the most part. This second part is going to be, we're going to step back and take a broader view of what you might be writing and how you can set up the arguments you want to make. So there's a very standard way that arguments are made and motivated. They usually involve 3 steps. And let's go through those 3 steps. The first step is you want to establish common ground. What does that mean? Well, you want to begin with something that your audience will accept as generally true or uncontroversial or familiar. Whether you're writing a sentence, whether you're writing a passage, whether you're writing a paragraph, people generally like to go from the old to the new, the familiar to the unfamiliar, the simple to the complex, the easy to the difficult. That's the general movement people want to be taken through. They first want ease, familiarity, simplicity, something that they can handle, okay? That's what I mean here. Give them something that they probably will accept as true, that they may already know is true, that they won't find particularly controversial. Get everyone on the same page, okay? Sit them all down, metaphorically speaking, and bring them all together and say, hey, this is what we know, okay? This is what we know. That's establishing common ground. The next move that you want to do is you want to introduce a problem. And this is often done with words such as but, however, nevertheless. These are the words that are used to signal that there's a problem, that you're introducing a problem. All right, that's the second step in the argument. Now, so the first step is basically, this is what we know. The second step is, this is what we don't know, or this is what we're unsure about, or this is what bothers us. You're introducing a problem. Now, a problem has 2 parts. The first part is just the situation, what is the problem? The second part is, what's the cost of the problem? Why should we care about the problem? What if we don't do anything? Is it really a problem? Is it going to really hurt us if we don't do anything? So there's got to be some kind of cost involved. There's got to be something hanging in the balance, some stake something at stake that if you don't deal with this problem, you're going to be sorry. That's what a true problem has, generally speaking. There's a potential cost involved. There's this problem. If we don't do something about it, it's going to really hurt us. And that's how you motivate your audience. You get them to see the potential problem that they're going to have. You get them to see the potential cost of not dealing with the problem. You know, so you get them motivated to do something about it. That's the second part. So establish common ground. Then you introduce a problem. A problem has two parts: the situation and the cost of the situation. And then the final part is you offer a solution to the problem. This is usually your main argument, the point or course of action that you're trying to get people to accept or to take is your solution to this problem that you've just identified. And this is a very common way to frame and make an argument in general. The reason I wanted to start this way is because the way that you frame and make an argument in economics is very similar to this. Very similar. Okay. So let's take a look at that. Making and motivating arguments in economics. So fortunately for us, your argument, your main argument, the place where it's most important to properly frame and make your argument is in the introduction to the paper. That's where you do this. And as Michael Weisbach in The Economist's Craft explains, you've got two goals in your introduction. The first goal is to state clearly the question that you're trying to answer. That's the first goal. What are you trying to understand in this paper? The second goal is to explain why it's worth asking and finding an answer to. In other words, why is the question interesting? Interesting to whom? Well, certainly interesting to the other economists who work on your particular topic. It's got to at least be interesting to them. If you can make it interesting to a wider group than that, more power to you. That's great. But certainly interesting to the people who already work on this topic. So, you know, what does the literature identify as the important questions to pursue? That's really what you're after here. You know, that's how academic disciplines operate, right? You know, I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, you know, there'll be a story in the news and they'll say, oh, I bet you the economists in your department is all over this. And I go, well, they're not. You know, news headlines don't set the research agenda in economics. It's the literature that sets the agenda. That's what sets the agenda. All right, so how do you do this? How do you make and frame an argument in economics? And especially this second one, how do you make the case that what you're doing is interesting? Well, fortunately, we have had two people who have spent their career looking at economics papers, sociology papers, etc., to find out exactly how academics do this. And I've already mentioned them. They're John Swales and Christine Feek. And they talk about it in their book, Academic Writing for Graduate Students. And so what do they find? What have they concluded here? Well, they've concluded this. They've come up with something called the CARS model, CARS, creating a research space. That's what it stands for, the CARS model. There are 3 moves, just as there were 3 moves in making an argument in general, there are 3 moves in the CARS model. Hopefully I've got them all down here, yeah. And we're going to talk about each one of these in more detail. The first move is you establish a research territory. Second move, establish a niche. And then the third move, you occupy the niche. Those are the 3 moves. I'm going to talk about each of these moves now, and I'm going to show you an example from a paper that exemplifies this almost to a T. Okay. First move, establish a research. Let me go back one slide. I can do this. Let me say this, because this came out in some of the emails I got. You can think of each of these moves as taking a single paragraph. Your opening paragraph, you establish a research territory. Your second paragraph, you establish a niche. And then at the beginning of your third paragraph, you occupy the niche. That would be a very effective way for you to think about constructing your introductions. In prepping for this workshop, I took a look at, I don't know, probably 50 articles in Econometrica, American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, on and on and on. And what I saw was in 80% of those articles, the authors were telling you what they were doing by the third paragraph, many times by the second paragraph. And of course, sometimes they do it in the first paragraph. And the reason I mention this is because, especially from young scholars, I often get a lot of resistance to this. Well, I don't want to tell them what I do in the second paragraph. I want to wait because I want to explain this and I want to set up that and I want to. Well, if you want to do that, you can. But what I'm telling you is the papers that I see that get published, they tell me what they're doing pretty early on. Most of them, the vast majority of them by the third paragraph, many of them by the second paragraph. And so I'm just saying that if you're interested in getting published, you should do what people who get published do, and this is what they do. They get to the purpose of their article pretty quickly. Okay, establish a research territory. This is basically you introducing your topic and making a case for its importance. That's basically what this is. And so let me offer you an example. Here's the opening paragraph of a very recent American Economic Review article. It's from 2023 on default effects. And this is their opening paragraph. And basically what they're introducing the subject, default effects, and they're basically telling you that these effects are large. And that default rules are widely used. So they're saying, hey, this is important. This is common in our society, and the effects of these things are large. That's the first move. So they're establishing a research territory. Now, a few things that I want to point out in this paragraph. Notice the subjective language. So a lot of times when I ask people, describe economics writing to me, one of the first things they say is objective. objective, objective. Well, economics writing has its subjective elements. So here you see they refer to, quote, large, unquote, effects. Later in the paragraph, they again refer to, quote, large, unquote, effect. That's a subjective word. They tell me that not only are default rules used, they are widely used. Widely is a subjective word here. So there's subjective, in making an argument, economists resort to subjective words. They do it all the time. Another thing to point out in this opening paragraph, the authors do not quantify the size of the effects. They just tell you that they're large, and then they quote some literature. Is that a good thing? I don't know. I'm just pointing it out. Would this have been a stronger paragraph with a couple of statistics thrown in? Perhaps. Perhaps. I'm just pointing that out. In the first one more thing to point out. In the first sentence, notice the expression appear to have large effects. Default rules appear to have large effects. That appear to is known as hedging, H-E-D-G-I-N-G, hedging. And hedging is a common practice in academic writing. So just, I'm just pointing out things that you should look at when you examine writing and try to learn from it. It's interesting that they don't really hedge in the rest of the paragraph. So instead of saying, so they say opt-out default rules increase enrollment. They don't say something like studies suggest that, which would be hedging. It's just kind of interesting. Anyway, that's what they do in this first paragraph. Single paragraph, they establish a research territory. Quoting literature along the way. So they're kind of folding in a literature review to a certain extent in this paragraph. Some of you asked about literature reviews. Sometimes, economists handle these in all kinds of ways. And what you should do is pay attention to how they do it and figure out what'll work for your particular paper. Okay, that's move one. Let's go to move two. Establish a niche. So what do these authors do now? In their second paragraph, it looks to me like they're establishing a niche. Look how they begin this paragraph. However, remember I said earlier, when you introduce a problem, it's often with a word like however or but or nevertheless. Here we have however. So basically in the first paragraph, they said, here's what we know about default rules. But there are two things, they tell us, that we don't really know. The first, and then the second. So here they are, in my view, establishing a niche, the second move in the CARS model. Again, a single paragraph, second paragraph of the paper. Note the subjective language, robust evidence, important unresolved questions. Important is a subjective word. Robust is a subjective word. There exists little evidence. Little is a subjective word here. Starkly different normative conclusion. Starkly is an objective word, a subjective word here. Making their distinction important for economic analysis. Important is a subjective word here. So part of building an argument in economics is using subjective words. You see it all the time. One more thing I want to point out here. When I see someone say there remain two important unresolved questions, what I expect to see is first, second, or one, two. And I get that here. The first is, and then later on, the second is. Okay. Explicitly labeling these as one and two. Establishing a niche. Second paragraph, second move. All right. Third step, occupy the niche. So you've just told me there's a problem. Now my expectation is that you're going to step in and tell me how you solve that problem. That's what I'm expecting. That's what I'm expecting. Okay. This is where you're going to tell me what your paper does, what it is you're doing in your paper. And in my view, this is what the authors do. In their third paragraph, they begin by telling me what they do in this paper. Now, let me let you look at this for just a moment. Because this is not a perfect paragraph. The first two were perfect. Third one, not quite so perfect. We're running out of time here. So they begin by saying, in this paper, we study default effects in the context of the Medicare Part D prescription drug insurance program in the United States. Now, notice that that statement does not respond explicitly to the two problems they identified in the previous paragraph. So I think they kind of slip a little here. What I want is something like, in this paper, we address those two problems, or we address the second of those problems, or we address the first of those problems, whatever it is they do. What I want to see at the beginning is an explicit reference to the problems that they just identified in the previous paragraph, but we don't get that. We don't get it. So it's not a perfect paragraph. They tell us in more detail at the end of the paragraph what they did. So they're going to cleanly estimate the effect of default rules, and they're going to test the implications of why those effects arise. That's what they're going to do. Still, in their third paragraph, they complete the third move. They're telling me what they're going to do in this paper. First paragraph, they introduced their subject and told me why it was important. Second paragraph, they identified a gap in the literature. And third paragraph, they're telling me how they're going to fill that gap in the literature. At least I think that's what they're doing. I don't know enough economics to know, but I think that's what they're doing. Okay. Carr's model, 3 moves. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to stop. We won't have time to talk about anything else today. But let me just recap real quickly, review what we've talked about. Clear writing begins with a subject followed immediately by a verb. Short subject followed immediately by a verb. Sentences, you can think of them as having old information and new information. we didn't talk about this at length. Old information is information your reader has already encountered. It's what connects the present sentence with what's gone before. New information is just that, information your reader has not encountered yet. And then making arguments, establish common ground, i.e., establish a research territory, introduce a problem, i.e., establish a niche, state your solution to the problem, i.e., occupy the niche. So let me stop here and just see if there are any questions before we have to adjourn. And I do, this was recorded, so you can go back and watch it if you want to. Probably tired of hearing me talk, so let me just see if any questions come through on the chat.
I think I will send a document for the people who want to register and they have a word for the next station. Sorry, and that's will able help us to work on some particular maybe problems and maybe for you to see some works and have some feedbacks for the people.
Sure, we can try that, Diana, and see how it goes. Sure, why don't we talk about that privately?
People have some question or
there is one. I'll register for the next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody is understand everything. So nice.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This has been recorded. Diane, I can also send you my slides and you can send them out to everyone if that's possible. I don't know if that's easy to do or not.
Yeah, it's possible.
Okay.
You can share in the documents your name, address, and I can send it to you.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your time and attention today. I hope this was helpful. I hope it made sense. I hope you take away something that is useful, that can immediately start helping your writing. And I look forward to seeing you at the next workshop.